Everyone's going to tell you this is a leadership book. It's not. Here's the thing. Brené Brown spent 6 years working with 150,000 leaders across 45 countries, building this framework, and somewhere in the middle of writing it down, her mother died. The book you're about to hear about isn't really about running better meetings or handling difficult conversations. It's about what happens when the ground under you actually moves, not metaphorically, actually. 3 things happen in this book that almost nobody talks about. 1, she writes the whole thing while grieving, and it shows in a good way. 2, she names a skill most of us have never even heard of, something she calls quarterback awareness, and it might be the most useful idea in the entire book. 3, she's honest, almost too honest, about the fact that some of this material is recycled from her earlier work, and she leaves it in anyway. So if you've ever felt like the floor of your life shifted while you were still trying to stand up straight, this one's for you, and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Today's mission is to completely unpack Brené Brown's 2025 release. It's called Strong Ground, The Lessons of Daring Leadership, The Tenacity of Paradox, and the Wisdom of the Human Spirit. Quite a title. Before we get into it, a quick note on the roadmap. I've pulled from a wide spectrum of material for this one. The book itself, obviously, but also Wharton Executive Education Insights, specifically some genuinely fascinating conversations she had featuring Adam Grant. I've gone through transcripts from her Curiosity Shop podcast series, and I've even pulled some candid, completely unfiltered Reddit reviews from everyday readers, which get brutal in places. The goal here is to bypass the sanitized corporate language and isolate the actual, usable tools for maintaining your footing when the world is trying to knock you over. I want to set the stage before getting into those tools, because the context around this release matters. You know her previous work, the vulnerability research, the shame research, Dare to Lead, Atlas of the Heart, all of that foundational material. Strong Ground pivots slightly. It looks at how technology, complexity, and the relentless pace of innovation are currently amplifying human dysfunction rather than solving it. The underlying premise she introduces early on is pretty stark. She basically says you cannot layer sophisticated AI or massive agile restructuring initiatives on top of a fundamentally dysfunctional human system and expect it to yield a positive result. If the people inside an organization are operating from a place of fear or isolation or self-protection, which so many are right now, then the shiny new technology is merely going to scale and accelerate that exact fear. It's a fear amplifier at that point, which brings us to the reception of the book. Digging through those Reddit threads and some of the critical literary reviews, there's a very consistent critique that keeps surfacing. A lot of readers are finding the book structurally uneven. Uneven is putting it mildly for some of them. One reviewer literally called it a charcuterie board of poetry, interviews, personal essays, and frameworks, and they were frustrated that it didn't cohere into a single clean step-by-step argument the way her earlier work did. That critique is entirely valid if you're evaluating it strictly from a structural standpoint. If you open this book expecting a linear corporate manual, step 1 do this, step 2 do that, you will be immediately thrown off balance. You've got a chapter dissecting the physics of a football play, sitting right next to deeply raw reflections on her mother's declining health. It's jarring. Then that's intermingled with transcripts of interviews with corporate executives. It absolutely jumps around. But pulling back and looking at the larger context, that unevenness is precisely why this deep dive is necessary. I think it's a reflection of the subject matter itself. Buried inside that seemingly chaotic structure are razor-sharp ideas and an emotional core that produces some of her most human writing to date. This isn't here to generate a polished, bulleted list for a middle management retreat. This is here to look at the raw mechanics of surviving disruption. Life does not present its challenges in a neatly organized table of contents. It throws grief, technological upheaval, and interpersonal conflict at you simultaneously. I actually want to push back on the expectation of the business book genre entirely here. We crave those polished, perfectly linear books that promise 3 easy steps to optimize your workflow, the airport bookstore specials, but those are actually the exact frameworks that fail us the hardest in the real world. Real leadership during a crisis is a messy charcuterie board. Think about it. You're dealing with a supply chain failure. an employee who's in tears over a personal issue, a new AI mandate handed down from the board, and your own health scare, all before lunch on a Tuesday. The reality of leadership is non-linear. So maybe this book's structure is a much more honest reflection of how we actually experience disorientation. When you're dealing with all of those overlapping crises before lunch, the primary challenge isn't executing a strategy. It's figuring out how to stand upright under the weight of it all, which introduces the foundational metaphor of the entire book. What does strong ground actually mean in a practical sense? This is where she grounds it in something entirely physical, which is what makes it land. It isn't a poetic phrase or a philosophical ideal. It originates on a pickleball court of all places. Chapter 1 details a severe back injury she sustained from overserving during a pickleball match. The pain is so debilitating, she describes it as writhing on the floor. She actually says she'll never use the word writhing metaphorically again. It was that bad. So she goes to a physical therapist named Tony, and what Tony diagnoses is fascinating because it maps so perfectly onto organizational behavior. He tells her the back isn't broken. The problem is that her core is weak, and because her core was weak, her body was relying on what he called inefficient compensating muscles to generate the power for the swing. Let's look at the mechanics of a compensating muscle for a second. When the primary structure, the core, is weak, the body instinctively creates a workaround. It borrows strength from peripheral areas that were never designed to bear that kind of load. So the lower back tries to do the work of the abdominals, which is a recipe for disaster. Over time, that borrowed strength leads to acute failure. So Tony's instruction to fix this wasn't just to do sit-ups or stand up straight. He told her she needed to find the ground. Which means what exactly? Because it's easy to picture someone just standing flat-footed on the floor doing nothing, but it's an active kinetic connection. He meant engaging the mind and body with the earth to build stability from the bottom up. He was teaching her how to find an athletic stance. This is a crucial distinction to make. Finding your ground does not mean turning into a rigid, immovable statue. If you're rigid, you snap when the wind blows. Think about a tennis player waiting to return a 120-mile-per-hour serve, or a martial artist squaring up. They're loose but grounded. They plant their feet, they lower their center of gravity, they engage the core, but they do all of that so they are ready to explode into motion in any direction. Stability without the capacity for agile movement isn't a stance, it's just being stuck in the mud. And the opposite of that athletic stance, which is unfortunately where most of us live when we are stressed, is the flinch. When we face unprecedented changes at work or deeply destabilizing moments in our personal lives, we tend to operate from a reactive crouch. The flinch response is so visceral, you can literally see it in a boardroom when a project goes sideways, shoulders go up, breathing gets shallow, people start guarding their territory. When you feel paralyzed or diminished by uncertainty, rather than sharpened by it, you have lost your stance, you're flinching. And Brown points out a very difficult truth here. The remedy for the flinch is not forcing yourself to feel calm, which never works anyway. If you are under active threat, whether that is a layoff rumor or a personal crisis, forcing a feeling of calm is biologically nearly impossible. The remedy is to deliberately reconnect to your core values, your why, and physically and mentally re-establish that athletic stance. She brings this concept to life with a metaphor in chapter 2 that is genuinely incredible, and it involves the Philadelphia Eagles. The tush push, or the brotherly shove, depending on your regional loyalties. For anyone who don't watch football, it's this highly controversial, nearly unstoppable short yardage play. The quarterback crouches low, takes the snap, and the players behind him literally shove him forward through the defensive line. It's wild to watch, but Brown doesn't just use it as a folksy teamwork analogy. She actually consults astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson to explain the literal physics of why this play works, relying on Newton's third law of motion, which states that for every action there is an equal and opposite reaction. Tyson explains that the unstoppable power of that play doesn't come just from the mass of the players, it comes from the earth. When the offensive linemen drive their cleats into the turf and push down, the earth pushes back up through them with an equal and opposite force. The ground provides the leverage, but the flip side of that equation is what hits hardest. If a player loses their footing, If their cleats lose contact with the grass, they can only exert a force equal to their own body weight, which is nothing. Against a 300-pound defensive lineman, your own body weight means absolutely nothing. You are immediately swept away. The moment you lose contact with the ground, you lose all of your force. Mapping that Newtonian physics lesson onto human behavior and leadership, the ground represents our foundational values. It is our clarity of purpose, our integrity, our sense of mutual trust. If you or the members of your team lose contact with those core values, the collective force of the group evaporates. You are no longer leveraging the power of the ground. You are just throwing your own emotional body weight around. And in a corporate environment, throwing your weight around usually manifests as toxic panic, blaming others, or total burnout. It makes you think about how we structure modern companies. Imagine trying to install a massive high-torque Formula One engine into a rusted-out, decaying chassis of an old car. It would tear it to pieces. It doesn't matter how advanced or powerful the engine is. The second you hit the gas, the sheer torque is going to tear the frame apart because the underlying structure cannot handle the force. That is exactly what we are doing when we force teams to adapt to massive market shifts or implement aggressive AI models without first ensuring their human core, their trust, their psychological safety, their grounding is intact. We are tearing the chassis apart. To build a chassis that can actually withstand that kind of torque requires confronting things we naturally want to avoid. We have to look at the micro fractures in the foundation, which leads to a part of the book that represents a pretty jarring shift in tone, but is absolutely vital to understanding everything she's trying to teach. Let's talk about her mother, because this is the emotional core that anchors all the physics metaphors and leadership frameworks covered so far. It's worth pausing to recognize the context here. This is Brown's first major release since her mother passed away, and the grief is palpable throughout the book. Sometimes it's sitting quietly in the margins, and sometimes it's taking center stage. There is a specific ritual she describes early on that is genuinely heartbreaking. She writes about how for every book she has ever published, when the publisher ships that first box of author copies to her house, she opens it and takes the very first book off the top. That first copy always goes to her mom. The second copy becomes her own travel copy, but for strong ground, there is no mom there to hand it to. Yet she maintains the ritual. She symbolically sets that top copy aside anyway, and in doing so, begins to reflect on how her mother would have received this particular book. She notes that her mother would have spent the most time in chapter 4, which is titled Paradox in the Human Spirit. And the explanation of why she would gravitate to chapter 4 is genuinely revealing if you're familiar with Brené Brown's larger body of work. She explains that her mother was reading Carl Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist, and actively going to therapy decades ago. We're talking about the 1970s and 80s, an era when that kind of deep psychological exploration was absolutely not normalized, especially not in a conventional Texas family. Her mother was the one doing the incredibly lonely work of surfacing the unsaid things. She was dealing with the messy, paradoxical realities of human emotion, while everyone else was just trying to keep up appearances. The implication here is profound. Brown is drawing a direct, undeniable line from her mother reading Carl Jung at the kitchen table to her own decades-long career as a vulnerability researcher. This is not merely a touching eulogy woven into a business book. This is the intellectual origin story of her entire life's work. The genesis of Dare to Lead, of her viral TED Talks, of her theories on shame, they all trace back to a mother who decided to stop flinching and find her ground. It's astonishing that this origin story is just sitting there in the middle of a book targeted at executives, and it entirely reframes how you take in the rest of the book, because this isn't just a manual for running a better team. This is a masterclass in organizing chaos into a system so you can survive grief. She is using the structure of a leadership book to process her own profound disorientation. She is building her stance in real time on the page. By doing so, she elevates the material from a clinical corporate strategy to a human survival guide. When the ground violently shifts under you, like it does when you lose a parent, you have to find a mechanism to stay upright. Writing this framework was part of how she found the ground, which raises a genuinely uncomfortable question about how we operate today. Think about modern corporate culture for a second. We constantly hear this drumbeat demanding that leaders be authentic and vulnerable. It's the buzzword of the decade. It's written into company mission statements. But do we actually allow people the grace to grieve? Do we give a leader the runway to process that kind of disorientation and rebuild their ground publicly? Or do we secretly penalize them for not operating at 100% capacity? That tension highlights the vast difference between performative vulnerability and actual messy vulnerability. Corporate culture has developed a deep appetite for vulnerability, but only when it is safely packaged in the past tense. We love a polished anecdote about a failure from 5 years ago that ultimately led to a triumphant success. It makes for a great keynote speech. Everyone claps, someone cries, but corporate culture is incredibly intolerant of present tense grief. It struggles to accommodate a leader who is currently disoriented, uncertain, or in pain. The unspoken mandate is, be human, but only the inspiring parts of being human. Make sure your authenticity doesn't interfere with this quarter's projections. It's a sanitized version of humanity. We want the aesthetics of vulnerability without the inconvenience of actual human struggle. Navigating that contradiction, the pressure to form certainty while internally managing profound disorientation, requires a highly specific cognitive skill, which she names in the book. You have to be able to hold the tension between the reality of your pain and the demands of your environment without fracturing. This brings us to a concept she calls negative capability. It sounds like a stealth technology on a fighter jet, honestly, but it's actually about internal endurance. If we define strong ground physically as an athletic stance, how do we define negative capability psychologically? Negative capability is originally a term coined by the poet John Keats, but Brown adapts it here as a psychological framework. It is the capacity to hold seemingly contradictory truths and to tolerate deep, profound uncertainty without succumbing to the frantic need to resolve the inherent tension. It is incredibly hard. It is the discipline of sitting in the messy, uncomfortable middle of a problem without rushing to a premature black and white conclusion just to relieve your own anxiety. She points out that when we lack this capability, when our internal ground is weak, we fall into one of two massive traps, and identifying which trap you fall into is probably the most important self-diagnostic in this whole book. The first trap is resolving discomfort too fast. Let's unpack the mechanics of that one. The leader who resolves too fast is someone whose nervous system just cannot handle ambiguity. They need an answer, any answer. When faced with a complex problem with no clear answer, the discomfort of not knowing becomes unbearable. So to relieve their own internal anxiety, they force a solution. They issue a rigid mandate. They make a hasty, definitive ruling. They don't actually know if it's the right answer, but declaring an answer creates an illusion of certainty, which temporarily calms their flinch response. We see this all the time. It's the executive who rushes a flawed product launch because the anxiety of missing a quarterly target is worse than the reality of shipping bad code. They resolve the tension too fast, and they break the system. The second trap is the mirror opposite, avoiding the discomfort too long. This is the ghosting response. This is the manager who sees a storm brewing. They know two of their top performers are locked in a toxic conflict that is destroying team morale, but the emotional tension required to sit them down and confront the issue is so uncomfortable that they just pretend it isn't happening. They look the other way. They completely avoid it. They schedule another meeting to plan a meeting. They hope it magically resolves itself. Both traps, resolving too fast and avoiding too long, are defense mechanisms. They are ways of armoring up. Under pressure, we react from a place of self-protection and assumption rather than from a place of curiosity. The question becomes, how do we dismantle that armor in the heat of the moment? This is where the Wharton executive education material gets genuinely practical. Adam Grant and Brené Brown have a fascinating overlap in their research regarding how to dismantle that defensiveness. Brown introduces a linguistic tool designed to interrupt the armor. When you feel that tension rising, and you feel yourself making assumptions about someone else's motives, you name the assumption out loud by saying, "The story I'm telling myself is." Let's look at why that specific phrasing is so mechanically effective. Say a colleague leaves you off an important email chain, which happens constantly. Your flinch response might be to assume they are intentionally cutting you out to steal credit. If you confront them by saying, "Why did you cut me out of this project?" you are accusing them of a fact. You're attacking, and their amygdala immediately registers a threat. They become defensive, and the conversation degrades into an argument. But if you use the tool, you say, "Hey, I noticed I wasn't on that email, and the story I'm telling myself right now is that you were trying to cut me out of the loop." You're taking complete ownership of your internal narrative. You are admitting that this is a story generated by your own anxiety, not necessarily an objective truth. You're essentially inviting them to correct your narrative rather than forcing them to defend their character. And Adam Grant brings a supplementary vulnerability approach to this dynamic. His research demonstrates that opening a high-stakes conversation with a statement of localized vulnerability radically alters the chemistry of the room. It totally disarms people. If you open by saying, "I don't have the full picture here, and I might be totally off base, but I want to make sure I understand this," it acts as a massive de-escalator. It signals to the other person's nervous system that you are on a search for truth, not a search for dominance. Here's an analogy for negative capability. Think about watching an incredibly tense psychological thriller movie. The suspense is building, the music is swelling, and you don't know what is going to happen. If you are someone who resolves too fast, you grab the remote and fast forward to the last 5 minutes just to see who the killer is. You ruin the movie, but you relieve the anxiety of suspense. If you are someone who avoids too long, the tension gets so unbearable that you just turn the TV off completely and go fold laundry. You abandon the story. Practicing negative capability means sitting in the dark theater, breathing through the spike in your heart rate, and trusting yourself to let the story unfold at its own pace. Sitting in that theater requires immense internal discipline. But managing your own internal tension is only half the battle, because while you are sitting there holding space for the unknown, the external environment around you is still moving, often chaotically. The world doesn't pause for your internal growth. How do you maintain your ground when the external variables are shifting rapidly? This brings us to a concept that might be the most underappreciated framework in the whole book: quarterback awareness. This section completely changes how you evaluate your own presence in a room. Let's break down the physical reality of what a quarterback is actually doing during a play. If a quarterback takes the snap from center and immediately locks their eyes onto their primary receiver, entirely ignoring the rest of the field, what happens? They get completely obliterated by a linebacker coming from their blind side, or they throw an interception because they didn't see the safety rotating over to cover the pass. Tunnel vision in the pocket is fatal. A master-level quarterback operates with dual awareness. They are highly focused on executing the immediate micro-decision, throwing the ball to a specific spot at a specific time, but simultaneously, their brain is tracking the entire macro environment. They are sensing the pressure of the defensive line collapsing. They are aware of the game clock. They are tracking the shifting zones of the defense. They are processing an enormous amount of macro data while executing a micro task. Brown connects this dual awareness to the broader concept of systems thinking, specifically pulling from the work of Donella Meadows, who was a pioneering environmental scientist. This isn't just about sports. This is about understanding how interconnected structures behave. Meadows' work on systems thinking is foundational here. A system isn't just a collection of parts. It is a set of elements interconnected in a way that achieves a function. Systems thinking requires you to look beyond individual events and see the underlying patterns and feedback loops. It's understanding how a change in one node of the system ripples through the interconnections and creates delays or compounded effects elsewhere. So translate that into a corporate conference room. What does quarterback awareness look like when you are sitting at a table trying to negotiate a budget cut? Without it, you are only listening to the literal words the person across from you is saying in that exact second. You are staring at the primary receiver, tunnel vision. With quarterback awareness, you are maintaining a macro view of the system. While you listen to the argument about the budget, you are simultaneously tracking the trajectory of your long-term relationship with that person. You're reading the body language of the other people at the table who just crossed their arms, who suddenly went quiet. You are running a mental simulation of how this budget cut is going to impact a department that isn't even in the room. You are tracking the unsaid power dynamics and the historical baggage of past decisions. You are seeing the entire field. It's worth pausing here because this sounds incredibly daunting. Maintaining that level of dual awareness, tracking everyone's micro expressions, the historical context, the future implications, all while trying to articulate your own point, sounds exhausting. Is quarterback awareness just a sanitized term for anxiety? Because hypervigilance, constantly scanning a room to see how everyone is reacting to you, is a trauma response. How is this different from just being terribly anxious and overthinking everything? That is the most critical distinction to make in this entire framework. Hypervigilance and quarterback awareness may look similar from the outside, but they run on entirely different internal engines. Hypervigilance is fear-based. It is an anxiety response driven by a dysregulated nervous system. When you are hypervigilant, you are frantically scanning the environment for threats because your core feels fundamentally unsafe. You are looking for reasons to flinch. You're waiting to be attacked. You are scanning the room to see who is mad at you, who is judging you, or where the next attack is coming from. Hypervigilance drains your energy because it's driven by panic. True situational awareness, quarterback awareness, is grounded and intentional. It is mastery-based, not fear-based. You are scanning the field not out of panic, but out of profound curiosity and a desire to understand the system so you can navigate it effectively. Because your stance is strong, because you are rooted in your strong ground, the incoming data doesn't overwhelm your nervous system, it simply informs your next move. You aren't asking, is that person mad at me? You're asking, how does that person's frustration affect the flow of information in this system? One is defensive, the other is diagnostic. But even if you have that diagnostic clarity, there are still going to be moments when the system breaks down. What do you do in the crucial 15 seconds when the defensive line breaks through, the pressure is immediate, and the pocket is actively collapsing around you? This brings us to chapter 14, which introduces the physical mechanics of surviving that exact moment. Chapter 14 is universally praised across the reviews. People highlight it as the strongest, most tactical chapter in the book. It introduces a concept called pocket presence, which she breaks down into two distinct physiological and psychological phases: locking in and locking through. Let's examine the first phase, locking in. This is a state most professionals are intimately familiar with. It is the hyper-focus required to execute a demanding task under pressure, a flow state. It requires immense mental toughness to block out all peripheral distractions and channel all of your cognitive resources into a single point of execution. We deeply understand locking in. In fact, we fetishize it. Corporate hustle culture gives out awards for people who can lock in the longest. It's the surgeon focusing entirely on the micro-incision. It's the crisis PR manager writing the statement while the stock plummets. It's the parent tuning out a crowded, chaotic grocery store to de-escalate a toddler's meltdown. Locking in is a necessary survival skill. The catastrophic failure occurs because we ignore the vital second half of the equation, locking through. This was the biggest revelation in the book, because most of us almost never do it. What exactly is locking through? Locking through is the active, intentional process of integration and transition. It is the conscious shifting of your brain state from that narrow, deep, intense focus back out to a diffused, broad awareness, the recovery phase. When you lock through, you are intentionally signaling to your nervous system that the acute threat has passed, allowing you to bring more things back into your awareness without simply compartmentalizing the stress you just endured. To explain the biology of this, she brings in her trainer, Courtney, from chapter 12, and uses a fitness metaphor. She describes leadership resilience as a kettlebell workout. She cites an author's explanation of how muscular hypertrophy actually works. You do not build muscle while you are lifting the weight. The act of lifting the weight, the strain, actually causes micro tears in the muscle fibers. You are breaking the muscle down. The muscle only grows stronger and increases mass during the recovery phase when the fibers repair themselves. That cycle of strain followed by repair is the fundamental rhythm of biological growth. The problem is that modern work culture demands perpetual strain, perpetual lifting. If you only ever lock in, If you go from one high-stakes meeting to a crisis email to a tight deadline, you're continually tearing the muscle fibers without ever allowing for the repair phase. Eventually, the muscle doesn't just get tired, it tears completely. That is what clinical burnout is. It is the structural failure of a system that was denied recovery. Here's an analogy related to running. Imagine a sprinter running a 100-meter dash. Before the gun goes off, they take a massive breath. They lock in and they sprint. But imagine if, when they cross the finish line, they just kept holding their breath. They hold their breath while they walk back to the locker room, while they get in their car, while they drive home. That's insane. It's completely unsustainable. But that is exactly what we do cognitively. Corporate culture yells, sprint to the end of the third quarter, lock in for this product launch. We hold our breath for 3 months. And when the launch is over, we never lock through. We never consciously exhale and transition our nervous system. So we walk into our homes, sit down at the dinner table with our families, and we pass out because we haven't exhaled since Tuesday. It is the cognitive equivalent of hypoxia. Locking through requires a deliberate pause. It means acknowledging the massive emotional and cognitive spend you just made. It might mean sitting in your car for 5 minutes in silence before walking into your house. It might mean taking a 10-minute walk around the building after a brutal performance review before opening your inbox. You have to actively transition the system. So we've traversed a massive amount of theory here. Newtonian physics, Carl Jung, systems thinking, muscle hypertrophy. But let's land the plane. How do we actually operationalize this? When you wake up tomorrow morning, log into work, and immediately feel the ground shift underneath you, what are the actual mechanics of rebuilding the stance? The foundational realization to carry into tomorrow morning is that strong ground is not a permanent trait. It is not an achievement badge you unlock by finishing the book and then possess forever. It's not a destination. It is a highly perishable stance. You have to consciously rebuild it piece by piece every single time life or work knocks you out of it. It is a daily, sometimes hourly practice, and the most common reason we get knocked out of our stance involves the friction of interpersonal power dynamics. Brown makes a really sharp distinction on the concept of power that clarifies a lot of organizational dysfunction. She asks us to evaluate whether we are defaulting to power over or power with. Power over is the default setting for a dysregulated system. It is driven entirely by fear and scarcity. A leader relying on power over uses control, division, intimidation, and blame to protect a very fragile ego. They want to dominate. They hoard information and pit team members against each other because they are terrified that if power is shared, their own relevance diminishes. Power with operates on a fundamentally different physics. It recognizes that power is not a zero-sum game or a finite pie. Power actually expands when it is shared. It involves moving away from finding someone to blame and moving toward mutual accountability and collective capability. But moving from power over to power with requires an immense amount of trust. And when you are in the middle of a crisis, trust is usually the first thing that fractures. So how do you practically rebuild that foundation with a colleague when things have gotten messy? This is where Brown imports a framework from her previous work, but applies it brilliantly to this specific context. The Braving Trust Inventory. The Braving Inventory is arguably the most practical diagnostic tool she has ever created. It breaks the massive abstract concept of trust down into 7 distinct observable behaviors, because trust is just too vague on its own. When trust breaks down, it usually isn't a total collapse of character. It's a failure in one of these specific areas. Let's examine how these mechanics actually function in a high-stakes environment. B stands for boundaries. Setting boundaries isn't just about saying no. Mechanically, it is about making explicit what is okay and what is not okay, and then holding people accountable for respecting those limits. In a chaotic system, unspoken expectations breed resentment. Boundaries make the implicit explicit. R is for reliability. Reliability is consistency over time. It means you do what you say you are going to do, repeatedly. In a corporate setting, the enemy of reliability is often people-pleasing. We overpromise in a meeting just to relieve the immediate tension, knowing we can't actually deliver the result by Friday. That tiny betrayal of reality destroys ground. A is for accountability. Accountability requires owning your mistakes, apologizing for them without caveats, and actually making amends. It means eliminating the phrase, "I'm sorry you felt that way." It's a non-apology that shifts the blame onto the other person's emotional reaction. True accountability says, "I made this error, here is the impact it had, and here is how I am fixing it." V is the vault, and it might be the most insidious one, and the one most people need to work on the most. The vault means you do not share information or experiences that are not yours to share, like gossiping. When we are stressed, gossiping about a third party can feel like a cheap way to build false intimacy with the person in front of us. But mechanically, it does the exact opposite. If a leader gossips to you about someone else, your brain immediately registers a threat. If they will share someone else's secrets with me, they're definitely sharing my secrets with someone else. The ground instantly crumbles. You have to be a closed vault. I is for integrity. Integrity is choosing courage over comfort. It is choosing what is right over what is fun, fast, or easy. It is the daily practice of your values, rather than just pointing to a list of values printed on a poster in the break room. N is for non-judgment. This is a tricky one. Non-judgment doesn't mean you abandon standards or accept poor performance. It means that I can ask you for what I need, and you can ask me for what you need, and we can discuss our struggles without assigning moral failure to the need for help. It removes shame from the learning process. And finally, G is for generosity. Generosity is a cognitive choice. It means extending the most generous interpretation possible to the intentions, words, and actions of others. Before assuming malice, you assume they're doing the best they can with the tools they currently have. So the idea is that when a project fails or a relationship gets strained, you don't just throw your hands up and say, "I can't trust them." You use the inventory diagnostically. You ask, where exactly did the ground crack? Was it a boundaries issue because we didn't define the scope? Was it a reliability issue because they missed the deadline? Was it a vault issue because someone talked out of turn? It gives you specific coordinates to repair the damage. It transitions trust from a vague feeling into a tangible metric you can manage. I do want to offer some real pushback here though. Looking at this braving inventory and looking at linguistic tools like the story I'm telling myself is, a lot of this language can feel incredibly unnatural. It can feel heavily scripted, like you're reading from a laminated card in a corporate HR training. If you go to your boss, who is furious about a missed deadline, and you say, "Let's do a braving inventory on this relationship," you're gonna get laughed out of the room. This framework is supposed to be for everyone. Parents dealing with teenagers, freelancers managing difficult clients, entry-level workers. How do you implement this without sounding like you've been brainwashed by a leadership retreat? That's an incredibly valid critique, and if you execute the tool robotically, it will absolutely backfire because it lacks authenticity. The key is to understand that you are adopting the mechanic of the tool, not memorizing a script. Take the story I'm telling myself is, the underlying mechanic is simply claiming ownership of your own anxiety and lowering the other person's defensiveness. You don't have to use those exact words. You could say, "Hey, my brain is jumping to worst case scenarios right now," or "I feel like I'm missing some context and I'm starting to assume things." The words are different, but the mechanic is identical. You are inviting dialogue instead of hurling an accusation. You have to translate the physics of the framework into your own natural vernacular. Make the mechanic your own, adapt it to the actual relationship you're in. And if we bring everything together now, it lands on a final perspective on strong ground as a whole. As acknowledged at the beginning, this may not be Brown's cleanest, most perfectly linear book. You will encounter detours, recycled frameworks, and a structure that requires you to connect a lot of dots yourself. But if you're willing to strip away the expectations of a traditional business book and engage with the raw material, what you're left with is a profound masterclass in surviving deep disorientation to crystallize the most vital takeaways to carry forward. Remember the necessity of negative capability. Build the internal endurance to sit in the tension of uncertainty without rushing to force a bad solution just to relieve your own anxiety. Practice quarterback awareness. Cultivate the dual vision required to execute the immediate task while continuously tracking the macro flow of the system around you. And perhaps most importantly, develop your pocket presence. Don't just lock in and hold your breath until you pass out. Deliberately lock through. transitioning your focus to recover, repair, and integrate. And underneath all the sophisticated systems theory, the physics metaphors, and the actionable acronyms, there is that profound emotional anchor, the anchor of her mother. The realization that this entire ecosystem of thought, frameworks used by millions of leaders globally, exists simply because one woman, Brené's mother, decided to stop flinching. She was willing to read weird books, go to therapy when it wasn't popular, and do the terrifying work of saying the unsaid things in her family. The generational impact of one person deciding to find their strong ground is staggering to think about. It's a testament to the ripple effect of genuine vulnerability, and it leaves one final question worth sitting with. Building directly on the courage of her mother's example, what is the unsaid thing in your own life or organization right now that, if you finally found the strong ground to say it out loud, could become the foundation for your own future transformation? That's the exact right question to leave on. Thank you for joining this deep dive into strong ground. Take a deep breath, exhale, find your athletic stance. Catch you next time.